Hey, A-Pushers. So I want to start off by apologizing for not being there in class today. I'm also going to apologize for all the noise you're going to hear in the background. My dogs are unusually playful tonight, so you're going to hear a lot of tippy-tapping of their claws, I'm sure. But today we're going to be talking about the causes that led to the American Civil War. This is 5.1, A Nation Divided. And so the first of these four main causes that we're going to look at is sectional issues. We're going to be looking at the various regional problems and the things that divided us already as a nation, regardless of any actual fighting that would eventually happen. So we start off with the North. This picture is of New York City around 1850, and as you can tell, it's from the more upscale part of New York City. Now, as far as Northern culture is concerned, the social aspects of it was a lot more community-based than you would find in the South. A lot more metropolitan, a lot more libraries and public theater and art than you would find in the South. And also, it was more egalitarian. There was a little bit easier shifting between the upper, the middle, and the lower classes, and it was a lot more based on hard work rather than birthright. Politically, we're going to see that this area is run by political machines and by the wealthy social elite. As far as political machines, the most notorious of all of them was Tammany Hall, located in New York City. That was the kind of political machine of the Democratic Party during this period of time. And as far as the wealthy social elite, these are people that had large amounts of money for many, many, many generations. We're talking everybody from the Adamses to, and other signers of the Declaration of Independence, wealthy businessmen, and so on. Economically, we know that the area is known for being focused on industry. They have this growing factory system, as well as especially the textile industry. We know that the upper areas, the New England areas, are still going to be known for timber and lumber and shipbuilding. There's also still a lot of fishing. Banking and finance are going to also be a huge part of the northern economic system. The immigrant classes are going to provide the labor. However, it also does increase these social tensions because they are seen as outsiders, taking people's jobs, etc. Now, in the South, it's just about as different as you can possibly have. First of all, there has always been this very distinct individualistic attitude in the South. They are independent, fiercely independent. They are very used to doing things on their own, very self-sufficient. Because of this individualism, and this self-reliance, they do not trust authority. They do not trust outsiders. They believe that they can do it on their own and do not like others telling them what to do. As far as the social system, we have the Old South aristocrats versus the cotton aristocrats. So these are kind of your tobacco aristocrats versus your cotton aristocrats, your old versus new. With the older ones, like I said, many of them made their money from rice and tobacco. They lived largely in the Chesapeake or in the port cities of South Carolina or Georgia. They are going to have these very privileged lifestyles, and it is going to be kind of maintained through marriage. That, one wealthy family marries their children to another wealthy family to kind of keep the quote unquote good breeding together. Now, the cotton aristocrats are going to be from the newer breed that comes at the late part of the 1700s. These are people that made their money through the cotton industry, and they are going to be a little less inclined to this kind of strict social hierarchy of the wealthy identity through marriage. However, they do still kind of attach to those same general guidelines of the aristocrats, the upper class, having the control over the other classes. Both groups had extremely extravagant lifestyles, huge homes, fancy parties, and those types of things that you did not see in the other social classes of the era. The other thing that's going to be very important to know about the planter elite is this ideology of benevolence, which we kind of touched upon in one of our previous lessons. Benevolence was this idea that excuse me, slavery was a good thing. In fact, John C. Calhoun in 1837 gave a speech titled "Slavery as a Positive Good." That they saw slavery as a normal condition, that it was the natural result of kind of their white racial superiority. And so they saw this, their peculiar institution as being a good thing. George Fitzhugh writes a book titled Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters, essentially saying that if slaves did not have masters, that they would be reduced to tribalism and cannibalism and, would not be able to live good Christian lives. But because they have been enslaved, they now, have been Christianized and anglicized and so on. And so it is a good thing for them. Now, again, something that we kind of touched upon a little bit in a previous class was the division of Southern slave ownership. And as I mentioned before, in 1860, only about 25% of Southerners owned any slaves. And that was due to the high cost of slaves. As you can see from this pie chart here, it shows you just how unusual that idea of the very large plantation with hundreds of slaves is almost more mythology than it is fact. And the reason for that is that, like I said, slaves were so expensive that the majority of people in the South could not afford them. And that gives you also an idea of that small grouping of people, that like 2% of people that have 50 or more slaves. Those are the people that are controlling the South. Those are the people that have that massive political and social and economic control. Now, the reason for all this is because in 1807, the Constitution ended the international slave trade. What this did is it created, no pun intended, a black market and for slaves. There were some that were smuggled into the United States through some of the Caribbean islands. However, the majority of movement of slaves during this period of time was actually from the upper South down to the lower South, from the Chesapeake down to the deep South. And that was because tobacco was waning a little bit in its profitability while cotton was rising. Cotton was mainly being grown in the deep, deep South, and that was where they desperately needed those slaves. Excuse me. And so that's why the price for the average slave goes up dramatically. And one additional thing to kind of note about this is that the more profitable the slave trade became, the more it affected slaves and their families. That we see that about a quarter of all slave marriages were destroyed by this trade during this period of time. That 1/3 of slave children under the age of 14 had been separated from their parents. So this gives you a very clear idea that they were not concerned about the welfare of the slave families or the welfare of the children in the sense of keeping them with their mothers or keeping them with their families, but they were concerned solely upon the wealth and the power that could come from the slave trade itself. So our second main cause that we're going to see is the westward expansion and states' rights. Now, we talked a little bit about in our last unit about how expansion westward caused more questions about the expansion of slavery, and that's really what this states' rights issue is going to be all about. So the Mexican-American War ends, and during that period of time, America is now officially achieving its manifest destiny from reaching from sea to shining sea. However, it does lead to a lot of conflicts over slavery, as well as the legal status of Native Americans, as well as Mexicans in the newly acquired territory. Who were they? What were they? What status do they hold? Um, Mexicans actually had the choice of going back to Mexico, where they could actually gain land if they went to Mexico, or that they could stay in the United States, in which case they got to stay in their homelands. Um, Once they had decided whether they were going to go to Mexico or stay in the US, then they had only a year to determine whether they were going to keep Mexican citizenship or take on American citizenship. Now, the vast, vast, vast majority of these 75,000 Mexicans that were living in the conquered territory, I believe it's like somewhere around like 90% of those, chose American citizenship because it could provide you with voting rights. The problem was, though, is that many of these people ended up losing the rights to the land that they had been living on, that they had purchased, that they had the deed to, and it was opened up to American citizens. So especially if you maintained your Mexican citizenship, your right to that land was very much in jeopardy. However, even if you took on American citizenship, you were still treated very much like a second-class citizen, even though they were labeled as white. And the reason for this is going from the word Hispanic, which comes from essentially the understanding that they were from Spain. And so, so the idea being, well, Spain is European and thus it is white. That's why these Mexican citizens, who are now American citizens, were considered white. Even though they were considered white, however, they were not treated on the same level as other more pale and pasty white Americans. Now, the other issue coming from the Mexican-American War that we kind of briefly discussed before was California. California wants to enter into the Union as a free state, but that's going to be a problem because it would disrupt the beautiful balance that we have in the Senate, and we don't want to do that. So there's a whole bunch of different solutions that are suggested. One of these is the Wilmot Proviso, and it said that this was suggested in the creation of the agreements that was going to allow California to enter the Union. And it was going to be this little amendment that said, all right, well, California can come in, but all the rest of the other areas, all the other territory, none of that Mexican cession territory can have slavery because Mexico didn't allow slavery, and thus we should not allow slavery in that territory. As you might guess, not very popular with the Southerners, and it didn't get passed. Another idea was, well, let's just extend the Missouri Compromise line. So please ignore my horrible drawings of America, as you guys are probably pretty familiar with at this point. I'm not the best artist, but we know that the Missouri Compromise had to do with the Louisiana Purchase territory, and it drew that nice little line across. Well, the idea was, well, let's just keep it going and just make it go all the way across. And that way, everything that was above the line would be free and below would automatically be slave. California was not down for this cause because we didn't want to get split, which was one of the other recommendations. Well, hey, to keep the balance, let's split California into two states, the northern half being free, the southern half being slave. And as I said, California, not down for that. And then the other idea was, okay, let California come in as a free state, but then we have to put together another really large state in the West that would be a balanced state for the free versus slave. And so they were looking at potentially making a balanced state in the South or out of the New Mexican cession territory. And that didn't fly over very well with the northern states either. So basically, nobody's happy. And this comes to a massive debate in Congress. It is known as the Congressional Debate of 1850. And there were these three men, these long-serving senators, who are going to be part of this debate. And they are they are well respected. They have been through thick and thin with America. These guys have been there through the best of times and worst of times. They are absolutely considered to be the most respected men in the American Congress at this time. They're known as the Great Triumvirate, or sometimes called the Immortal Trio. And you'll recognize them. The first of these is John C. Calhoun, known as the Great Nullifier. And John C. Calhoun, he believed that to deal with the slavery issue, we need to leave slavery alone, and not touch it, not approve it, disapprove it, basically just, let each state keep coming in as free or slave and just keep that balance. But we need to have two presidents, one elected from the North and one elected from the South, and that'll help solve our problems, and that will help keep the balance between free and slave states, rather than trying to keep a balance in the Senate. As you might guess, not a super popular idea. The other guy is Daniel Webster, famous of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty that got us the bunny ears of Maine. He is known as the Great Orator, and he was by far the greatest public speaker of his time. And he was against the extension of slavery, but he was so focused on preserving the Union that he was willing to compromise on the slavery issue if it just meant keeping the country together and not having any kind of civil warfare. And it all came down to Henry Clay. Yes, he's still alive. Henry Clay, known as the Great Compromiser, actually comes up with the compromise that will solve this problem. And this compromise would help balance the slavery interests, both pro and anti-slavery. And this is going to be important because it essentially says that Congress is neither supporting nor abolishing slavery. It's a very safe middle ground. And that is the Compromise of 1850. So there are four elements to the Compromise of 1850. So the first element of the compromise was that California would be allowed in as a free state. This was mainly just so that they could actually keep California, because California was willing to remain independent and not join the United States. They had the money for it. They had just won a war against Mexico. So they were like, we could do it. We could actually do this on our own. So they wanted to get California, and especially all the gold that had been found in California. So California allowed to enter in as a free state, basically drawing its own border lines as they saw fit. We kept the gold of the Sierra Mountains, as well as the water that went along the Colorado River. The second issue was adding a fugitive slave law. So we had fugitive slave laws in the past, but they definitely were not very much enforced. And this fugitive slave law was very restrictive, and it essentially deputized every person in the United States as an extension of the slavery system, that it was the job of every American citizen to find and return slaves to the South. Now, if you found a slave and returned them to the South, you were given a reward. If you were found to be avoiding turning a slave in or actively trying to help them escape, not only would you be fined, but you would be imprisoned, and the slave would then be returned anyway. So it was kind of trying to give people this incentive to return slaves because you could get this cash reward. The third element of the Compromise of 1850 is this thing called popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty, if we look at the words, popular meaning the people, sovereign meaning rule. So popular sovereignty was this idea that the people of each territory would have the ultimate rule over free versus slave. Essentially what this was doing was it was taking Congress's hands off the slavery issue. Congress is no longer going to be responsible for keeping a balance between free or slave. So as all these new areas are going to be coming in and trying to make states, each of those new potential states would get to decide for themselves, are we going to be free or are we going to be slave? And so that way it's not Washington, D.C.'s fault if there is a difference and if there is kind of a separation between the two. And then the final element was actually a national stance on slavery to an extent. It eliminated the slave trade in Washington, D.C. That meant that no slaves could be bought or sold within the national district's borders. Now, I know that sounds like it's not really that big of a deal because it didn't stop slavery from existing in Washington, D.C. There were slaves in the national capital, and it didn't stop the slave trade in the rest of the country. But it was a stance that we would not allow for the trading of slaves in our nation's capital. It's kind of the very first step of the federal government towards taking a stance officially on slavery. Now, while that was all well and good, unfortunately, things turned very bad very fast because just 4 years later, a couple of those territories that had been created throughout the Louisiana Purchase territory and as a result of westward migration, now those territories were actually having enough people that they could potentially become states. And that led to something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act that was passed in 1854. So this was proposed by a guy by the name of Stephen Douglas, and I'll be talking a lot about him over the next few slides here. So Stephen Douglas is going to propose the idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What the Kansas-Nebraska Act would do is, 1, essentially repeal the Missouri Compromise, and 2, open these territories open to popular sovereignty. So the areas of Kansas and Nebraska that were potentially going to be becoming new states, the assumption is that one would become free and one would become slave. Both of them are above the 3630 line, so typically they would have both been free. But with this idea of popular sovereignty kind of extending on from the Compromise of 1850, Congress gets to take its hands off the problem, and then they're not to blame. And it would just open it up to the votes of the people that lived in that particular territory. Now, the reason that this area was becoming so important, aside from that there were a lot of Americans living there, is that they were hoping to use this territory as a spot for a transcontinental railroad. It was going to be a major hub for the railroads. And so they wanted to be able to link all of those, new railroads through this territory. And if that was going to happen, they needed to determine whether it was going to be free or slave. However, because this essentially means that that these areas could be free or slave, a lot of people started moving there specifically with the purpose of swaying that election one way or the other. And this is going to lead to a massive fight between the two sides. So the competition for Kansas. The picture that we see here says forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. So I'll talk a lot more about the Free Soil Party in just a couple of minutes, but essentially a free soiler was somebody who did not want the extension of slavery into these new territories. So a lot of these free soilers moved to Kansas with the intent to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state, as most people had assumed it would. Right next to Kansas is the state of Missouri, and a lot of these people from Missouri, right before the election, went into Kansas and swayed the election in favor of slavery. Because they were not from Kansas, did not live in Kansas, and essentially just went over for the sole purpose of voting in a state that wasn't theirs, they were called border ruffians because they were causing these kind of conflicts over the issue of slavery as they crossed the border. And what this did is it led to the election showing that Kansas was going to be a slave state. The free soilers living in Kansas were furious about this because they didn't feel it was a fair or even legitimate election. And so they wrote their own constitution. They called it the Topeka Constitution. And it said that Kansas was a free state because they said, if you don't count those votes of the border ruffians, those people that don't even belong here, we would have won the election. However, the border ruffians are like, haha, well, numbers are numbers, and so we won. They write their own constitution called the Lecompton Constitution that said that Kansas was a slave state. And so now this entire state is in limbo. They have not officially been admitted into the Union because Congress doesn't know whether they're free or slave. And it leads to actual violence between the two sides, and it gave the territory the nickname of Bleeding Kansas. These were violent altercations between pro and anti-slavery advocates over the Kansas territory, and some of these were incredibly brutal and incredibly violent, which I'll talk a lot more about in just a little bit. But why this is also important is because many people, many historians consider Bleeding Kansas and this situation as being actually the very first blood shed over slavery, and thus can be seen as the unofficial beginning of the United States Civil War. That this is the first time we are fighting over the issue of slavery, of states' rights, of the states determining whether they are free or slave. And so there are many people who believe that this is kind of the unofficial start to the Civil War. Now, the reaction to Bleeding Kansas is pretty severe. First of all, there is a clash between two men of Congress. Senator Charles Sumner, who was a Northern abolitionist, had insulted slave owners in his speech called The Crime Against Kansas, where he was essentially saying that those border ruffians, went in illegally, voted illegally, and they were doing it for slavery, and that slavery supporters were, unsavory characters, that they were unfair, that they were dishonest, that they were violent, crude, etc. Every bad thing that you could possibly say about somebody. Well, one of the people that was being targeted in this wasn't actually in Congress, but one of that guy's friends, Senator Preston Brooks, was furious about this, and he felt that that Sumner had basically badmouthed his friend and wanted to defend him, and this led to an actual fight on the floor of Congress that was illustrated in this political cartoon. Brooks, who got the nickname of Bully Brooks, beat Sumner with a walking cane in retaliation for this, and beat him into unconsciousness. He actually had to be taken to the hospital, and both men were censured on the floor of Congress, which is the way of saying, like, Congress is like wagging the finger at you and saying, shame on you, shame on you. That was a really bad, embarrassing move, and we don't agree with it. But this political cartoon shows the intensity of it, that it says, Southern chivalry, the argument versus clubs. So when we talk about quote unquote chivalry, we think about propriety and morals and such. And we see Bully Brooks wielding this cane and beating Sumner with it, and Sumner being there with the pen and his speech about Kansas. So it's kind of that idea of, the pen being mightier than the sword. Trying to show that one side is superior morally and ethically than the other. One side is brutal and violent, and that's what happens when you support slavery. So what this fight did is it showed that even in Congress, compromise was now over. There was no more chances for compromise. We would not be able to solve the slavery issue because we were just too far divided at this point. The overall long-term results of this, the Democratic Party itself splits, and I'll talk a lot more about that in specifics, but they split over the issue of slavery. Kansas is still in limbo because they're not sure if they're free or slave, so they're not even added to the Union yet. And the slavery problem still is a problem. Which brings us to our third cause, abolitionism, the people who are actively trying to end the practice of slavery in America. So we haven't really gotten too much detail into what life was like as a slave in America at this point. And as you can see from the picture here, it was incredibly brutal. We have talked about both covert and overt methods of rebellion. A covert method of rebellion was slow work, would be things like accidentally breaking tools, or, I'm too sick to work, or something like that. Overt rebellions like Nat Turner's rebellion oftentimes were dealt with and retaliated with much harsher rules and regulations against slaves. However, even the covert methods of rebellion could end up in very severe punishment. Corporal punishment was incredibly common. Now, the man you see in the picture here, his name was Gordon, but he was many times also referred to, because of this picture, as Whipped Peter. He was an enslaved African American who escaped from a Louisiana plantation. And when he ended up with a Union Army group in Baton Rouge and in Louisiana, he was kind of like the first time that a lot of people in the North had seen just the extensiveness of the brutality of the corporal punishment that many slaves in the South lived through and endured. That this was a series of photographs that actually were distributed not just throughout the United States, but internationally to show the abuses of slavery. However, this photograph would not be available until 1863. So it would still be several years before many Americans knew just how brutal slavery truly was for the average black slave. Now, as far as escaping, we've all learned about the Underground Railroad. We've all learned about how both black and white abolitionists would work together to help slaves escape from the South along this secretive trail that would change all the time, and it was safe house to safe house and friendly person to friendly person, helping get them to freedom, get them across to safety. And the most well-known of all of these conductors was Harriet Tubman. So for those of you guys who aren't super familiar with Harriet Tubman, maybe you recognize the name, you know she was involved in the Underground Railroad, but you don't know too much about her. She is an absolutely fascinating individual. She was an escaped slave herself, and she returned to the South dozens of times to go help people escape to the North. And she helped rescue at least 80 people. We don't know the exact numbers because, again, it's a secretive situation, but she saved at least 80 people. And while that may not sound like a hugely high number, you have to remember that every time she went down to the South, she herself was in danger of being captured again and being sent back to the plantation where she had come from, as well as suffering severe physical punishment as a result of her transgressions. Now, Harriet Tubman's also really amazing because she did this while also suffering from narcolepsy, where she would have periods where she would literally just fall asleep for periods of time, which made the conditions of her escaping that much more difficult and dangerous and that much more amazing. Harriet Tubman, because of her ability to get people to safety and to help them escape, earned her the nickname of Moses. Now, in a lot of Negro spirituals at the time, you would hear them talking about Moses. Now, Moses in the Bible led the Israelites to freedom, that he helped free the Jewish slaves from the Egyptians. And they saw much of that in her, that she was leading the black slaves to freedom. And so many of the Negro spirituals refer to Moses, the biblical Moses, but they're also referring to Harriet Tubman at the same time and her bringing the slaves to the promised land. We'll talk more about the Negro spirituals in our next class, but just kind of keep those things in mind, that there was always this double meaning. Now, every once in a while, a book comes along and it absolutely revolutionizes an entire generation. In the 1700s, we had Thomas Paine's Common Sense that totally changed the way that people viewed the idea of independence. Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be our next major, turning point book. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by the woman you see here, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is a novel that dramatized the cruelties of slavery, and it told the story of Southern slaves and the cruelty of their masters and them being ripped apart from their families and being torn apart from their loved ones. And people were very emotionally touched by this. It created widespread anti-slavery support where there previously had not really been a lot of anti-slavery support. Basically, people who had either been uninformed or undecided at that point about the issue of slavery now felt like they had a moral reason why they could not agree with the practice. Some people, they didn't really have any association with it, so they didn't really care. Some people, they were like, well, it's a Southern thing, so it doesn't apply to us here. But after reading this book, so many people changed their minds. However, it was not universally popular. First of all, Northerners read this and they're thinking to themselves, oh my Lord, what a horribly cruel system. Look at these poor black slaves and how they're being treated so inhumanely. And it makes the white Southerners turn into absolute barbaric, cruel individuals. And we need to stop this for everybody's benefit. Southerners are reading the same book and they're like, what kind of Yankee abolitionist propaganda is this? Because what it painted the South to be was that A, everybody owned slaves, B, everybody that owned slaves was a horrible individual that cruelly beat all of their slaves, and that they were, vicious and vile just for the sake of being vicious and vile. And what a lot of these people were saying, they're like, that's not me. Please remember that pie chart that I showed you at the beginning of the lesson here. It showed that most people in the South didn't own any slaves. And even those that did, half of those that owned a slave owned less than 5. So most of them, they're not beating their slaves on a daily basis because they need them. They need them to work and they need them to help alongside the master. And so a lot of these Southerners are like, you're getting the slavery system all wrong. This is not what it's like for most of us. But it was still so emotionally drastic that it got a lot of people's attention. Now, why did she write it this way? Well, that's kind of a big question because she had never been to the South. She had never seen slavery for herself firsthand. She was kind of basing it off of what she had read in magazines and some people she had talked to, but for the most part, it's kind of from her own imagination. And so that was another reason why a lot of Southerners were really against it, is that she was not painting in their eyes an accurate portrayal of what Southern slavery was really like. Now, while we have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who's writing a book that's changing a lot of minds, we're going to talk about another person that that is involved in this and someone who we have actually spoken about in our last unit, and that is William Lloyd Garrison. Now, William Lloyd Garrison wrote a newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper known as The Liberator. And this was, The Liberator was a very important newspaper that was supported also by his organization, the American Anti-Slavery Society. And they promoted immediate and uncompensated emancipation. What that essentially means is they were not going to wait for slavery to end. They did not want to have it continue even one more minute. It needed to end now, and those that lost their slaves, too bad, so sad, sucks to be you. You were the one that was using this awful, inhumane system. You do not get any cash and prizes or any kind of compensation for the loss of your labor. Now, as you might guess, he's not very popular amongst people of the South, but he was also very controversial in the North as well because he did a lot of things to try and get his point across that were not very popular, including at one point, he burned a copy of the Constitution in protest as his way of showing that the U.S. Constitution was not being upheld and that the ideals of the Declaration of Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness and the equality of all men was also not being upheld. Now, another abolitionist, gonna take a slightly different tack, and that is John Brown. John Brown was a militant abolitionist. He believed that writing letters, writing newspapers, trying to get legislation passed wasn't going to be fast enough, that there needed to be a much more visible and a much more aggressive method to end slavery in America. And one of the things that he was involved in is actually bleeding Kansas himself. He and his sons were actually involved in a extremely brutal, murderous attack at Pottawatomie Creek. He and his sons essentially went into this region in Kansas where there had been a strong pro-slavery group, and they went in and they slaughtered pro-slavery advocates with hatchets. This is not a well man. But he would continue on in his fight for abolition at the raid on Harper's Ferry. So Harper's Ferry was a United States arsenal that was at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. And he was hoping to initiate a slave revolt. So 1859, he goes and he's planning to raid the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And his idea was he's going to steal all the guns, he's going to give them to the slaves, and the slaves are going to have their own uprising, they're going to kill their masters, and that will start the abolitionist movement, they will free themselves. Cool idea, didn't work out. There were about 20 people in his group. They were defeated by a company of the United States Marines. That a lot of his, the people that were supposed to back him up didn't show up. And so they were outnumbered. They were arrested. He was put on trial. He was convicted. And he was eventually executed for his role in this, for quote unquote inciting a riot amongst the slaves, basically trying to incite rebellion amongst the slaves. Now, he didn't actually incite any rebellion, but the fact was that in Virginia, anything like this could be seen by the white, aristocratic plantation-owning majority, that this was threatening to the slave system. And so he was actually executed for this. But when that happened, he became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. That he became kind of the symbol of the goals of the movement. When a white man died for the black cause, it too had a massive effect on causing people to try and end slavery. In fact, the very first picture that we see in this lesson here is actually a picture of John Brown, and there were songs written about him, that there were marches in his favor all across northern states. People were now kind of tacking on to the idea of abolition simply because a white man had died for this cause. Now, African Americans were fighting for abolition as well, and the two probably most prominent, outspoken abolitionists of the time were Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. Sojourner Truth is going to not only be fighting for the emancipation of slaves, but she was also a very fierce women's rights advocate. Frederick Douglass lectured very widely for abolitionism. He was an escaped slave, and he used his ability in reading and writing, and especially his brilliant oratory. He was a fabulous public speaker, and he used that as his way to convince people to end slavery. He even was a consultant for Abraham Lincoln on issues regarding slaves. So these people were incredibly important. And you're actually going to be watching two little videos that have speeches from each of them that you're going to be responding to after this film is over. And you're going to be looking at how they are going to be involved and be really, really, really important to the abolitionist cause itself. Now, this kind of ties the states' rights issue and the abolitionist movement together. And that's the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. So Dred Scott was a slave, the man you see pictured here, and he sued for his freedom after his master brought him to a quote-unquote free territory. So he had been brought to, I'm gonna say Illinois, don't quote me on that. Um, but he had been brought to a free territory from a slave territory. When his master decided to go home, he was like, no, we're in a free territory, so I'm just going to stay because I'm free now. And his master said no, tried to force him, and that's when he sued for his freedom. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, is going to have a very, very important decision. And it's going to have massive impacts in pushing us towards civil war over the issue of slavery. The first issue was slaves are not citizens, therefore they do not have the right to sue. So he was basically saying this case is thrown out no matter what. He said, but he kind of continues on from there and he says, first of all, even if he could sue, we would not find in his favor because slaves are property, not people. And so when they are brought to a quote unquote free state, they cannot be taken away from their master, because the only way that somebody's property can be taken away from them by the state is if they have committed a crime and been convicted of it. So we cannot take away your property, right? That's the Fourth Amendment. That's your right to privacy. That is your personal stuff. And so, because of that, when a slave is brought into a quote unquote free state, they are not free. They are still a slave, and can be used and kept and sold as a slave regardless of being in a quote unquote free territory. But what this also says is that he says that the Missouri Compromise was always unconstitutional because it created this free versus slave territory. And what the Dred Scott decision essentially said was there was no such thing as a free territory or a slave territory. As long as slavery existed in America, all American territory would be slave territory because slaves could not be taken away from their masters unless the masters freed them themselves. So even if a slave escaped and went to a free state, they were not free. They were still considered a slave. And this would be a really important thing to not only solidify much of the abolitionist movement, because people in the North were terrified, furious that slavery could exist in their territories, that they were proud were quote unquote free territories, but also that it led to this fear that slavery is going to start to spread into these territories that were previously free. And our final issue is going to be politics. Now, the second party system, as we have talked about, was the second kind of iteration of American political parties, and that was the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, parties at this time were still highly sectional. Northerners were typically Whigs, Southerners were typically Democrats, but each of those groups was starting to split over the issue of slavery and immigration. And now when we have these new territories that are dealing with the issue of free versus slave, it just heightens this issue even more. A great example of this is in 1852, we have Franklin Pierce, a Democrat, running against the Whig General Winfield Scott, who was a hero of the Mexican-American War. So typically you would think the war hero versus Franklin Pierce, a guy who's basically politically unknown, the general would win hands down. But the general was also outspoken against slavery, and that automatically made anyone that would potentially have voted for him from the Democrats just not going to do it. So it really has a huge divide. Now, a new party that evolves at this time is the Free Soil Party. So the Free Soil Party was a group of anti-slavery Northerners who broke off from the Whigs because the Whigs would not take an official stance on slavery. So they wanted to take an official stance. And the kind of official side of the Free Soil Party is that, one, they didn't want slavery to spread into the new territories, especially into the California territory and the remaining Louisiana territory. But they also felt that slavery undermined white wage labor. Why would you pay a white man, even an immigrant who doesn't get paid a lot, why would you pay him when you could get a slave to do the job for free? And so they had the rallying cry of free labor, free soil. In 1852, it would actually be the last national election for the Whigs because they would essentially fail over the issue of slavery. Half of them would split because they would be pro-slavery and half were anti-slavery. And the thing that really kind of solidified that was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so in that period of time, we're going to see the Whigs fail. The Free Soil Party kind of gain some more steam and gain some more interest, but then we are going to see also later on that there's going to be some new parties that develop from this. And that new party is going to be the Republican Party. So it was founded in 1854 by Northerners. Most of these Northerners were anti-slavery activists, modernizers, so people that wanted more modern transportation and infrastructure, as well as people who had been part of the Whig and the Free Soil parties. They very vociferously opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They felt that it was going to allow slavery to extend into the new territories. And the Republican Party is very important because they are the very first political party to take an official stance against slavery. They saw it as a moral evil that needed to be quashed. Their very first national candidate was John C. Fremont, who you might recognize as the man who led California to its victory against Mexico in our war for independence from Mexico. He was a staunch abolitionist. He was a hero of the Mexican-American War. And even though the Republican Party was very popular by the time that there was the next presidential election in 1856, just 2 years after their founding, Fremont would not end up getting the election, largely due to the fact that he was kind of this very outspoken, abolitionist, and also that there were the wicked rumors that he was actually Catholic, and that was enough to doom him right there. Now, when it came to the Republican Party, it also created a lot of buzz in the northern states where the Whigs had kind of fallen apart, and it left the space for the Republican Party to come in. And that's where Lincoln is going to show up. So in Illinois, there was a race for who was going to be the next senator, and it was going to be against the incumbent, Senator Stephen Douglas, the guy that created the whole popular sovereignty idea, the mastermind behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this tall, lanky, awkward-looking lawyer from podunk nowhere, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln's totally unknown, and he's going up against one of the most well-respected and well-known men in all of politics at the time. So clearly he's got a rough road ahead. So he puts together a whole series of debates, public debates between him and Stephen Douglas. Now, in reality, it didn't really matter what the outcome of these debates was, largely because Illinois actually selected its senators through their own legislature. So the people didn't even vote on who the senator was. It was the people of the legislature. So what they were doing essentially is he was trying to make a name for himself, but also draw attention to the problems that were facing the Democratic Party and that he felt the Republican Party could fix. And that major issue was slavery. And this is really obvious in what is known as the Freeport Doctrine. Lincoln asked Douglas a really difficult question. He said, would you, if a state voted against slavery and a state said they wanted to be a free state, would you support the people, or would you support the Supreme Court's decision from the Dred Scott case that says that there is no such thing as a free state? Now, the thing is, this is a lose-lose question for Douglas, because if he says that he supports the people, then he is not supporting the Supreme Court. If he says that he's supporting the Supreme Court and the national government and the supremacy of the federal government, he's not supporting the people. So it was a great question by Lincoln. Now, Douglas does the most politician thing ever. He doesn't answer the question. he straddles the issue. He kind of reminds everybody, like, hey, remember, I came up with the idea of popular sovereignty, and that allows people to voice their own opinions, and la 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 la. And he thinks that, it's going to be, helpful to basically have this kind of non-answer. Well, Douglas does win the election. That's true. Lincoln does not win, and he just kind of hangs around, but he's made a national name for himself. Douglas doesn't have this moral standing on slavery. He kind of takes the safe approach, but it's not really a stable approach, because what he's done as a result is he lost popularity with pro-slave Democrats, because he didn't outright say that slavery could exist in a quote-unquote free state. So the Democratic Party mostly is in the South, but there are a lot of Democrats in the North, including places like major cities. New York, Boston, Philadelphia had major Democratic numbers. And so those people, many of them were anti-slavery Democrats. And so the Democratic Party cracks in half over this issue of slavery. And a lot of that had to do with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so it all comes to a head in the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln is going to be nominated for the Republican Party, and they nominate him largely due to the success and the outspoken beliefs that he had and his passion when it came to the issue of slavery. Now, in reality, Abraham Lincoln morally believed that slavery was wrong. However, like most white Northerners at the time, he didn't believe that they were equal to white men. But he did say that if African Americans were denied basic rights, then it wouldn't be really that far of a jump to say that white immigrants could be denied basic rights. If slavery could spread, it could ruin opportunities for white immigrants and white laborers. And these types of ideas really resonated with a lot of people in the North, and people that typically would have voted for maybe even a Democratic candidate. Now, the Democrats, they actually nominate two candidates because they couldn't decide which one to nominate. A Northerner and a Southerner, one that was a pro-slavery and one that was an anti-slavery. So the Southern Democrat is a guy by the name of John C. Breckinridge, and the Northern Democrat is none other than Stephen Douglas. And so the Democrats are split over this. Well, what that does is it splits the vote. So it essentially blocks Lincoln to win the vote, and it locks him to win the election. Lincoln wins the election without a single Southern electoral vote. As you can see in the map here, nothing below Pennsylvania voted for Abraham Lincoln. He won with 180 electoral votes. That was the majority. It's interesting because you can see here the major difference between the electoral vote, which is massively in Lincoln's favor. But when you look at the popular vote, Lincoln doesn't have that much of a spread. But then what's interesting is you look at the popular vote here and you see the next one in line is going to be Stephen Douglas. But Stephen Douglas comes in last place when it comes to the electoral vote. And that's because he won the electoral vote in only one state, in two states. And so, so that's why he ends up losing. But he had a large number of people in general voting for him, just not enough to outdo Abraham Lincoln or outdo John C. Breckinridge. And so this is one of the continuing issues that we still have with our electoral college not matching the popular vote. But what this also is important, and this is probably the most important part of the election of 1860, is that it was the tipping point for the Southern states. They said that if Abraham Lincoln won the election, they would leave the Union. And the reason they felt so strongly this way is that they saw the writing on the wall. Abraham Lincoln had said many times before that he believed that slavery was morally wrong, and he would try and stop it from spreading. Southerners saw this as the writing on the wall that he was going to end slavery in America as they knew it, and they were going to do everything in their power to stop that. So they seceded, and in a very bold move, they literally stood up in the House of Congress and walked out. And that's how the South seceded. That was kind of their metaphorical and their symbolic secession from the Union. We'll talk more in a couple of classes about what that actually meant and how that actually went down in the actual paperwork that went into it. But just note that that all came down as a result of Lincoln's election in 1860. So that's the end of our stuff for here today. There's also going to be some President's Chart papers that are going to be up on the website for you guys to fill in about President Zachary Taylor and his very short time in office because, sorry, spoiler alert, he dies, as well as Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. We will be getting our next President's Chart here coming up, and I will print those out for you guys and get them for you guys next class. So fill out what you can, finish up your other work, and enjoy the videos with the abolitionist speakers. I think you guys are really going to enjoy them.